Hey, everybody. It is Wednesday, June 25th. You're listening to the Mo News Podcast. Good morning. I'm Mo Shwanunu.
Hello, everybody. I am Jill Wagner. This is the place where we bring you just the facts.
And we read all the news and we read between the lines so you don't have to. And sometimes, Jill, we enjoy our matcha Kit Kat bars from Japan while we record the podcast. Can you hear it?
I followed your trip every step of the way because you guys posted, of course, on Instagram. And I'm like, they are eating their way through Japan. It was
Mission
my takeaway.
Accomplished. And we brought home what we could bring home. I couldn't bring home any Kobe beef or sashimi with me. But one of the things in Japan that we talked about on the Instagram feed over on Premium is like the love of Kit Kat bars in Japan. And then they have like 200 different flavors. There's like sake flavor. There's wasabi flavor, which, by the way, surprisingly good for a wasabi flavored Kit Kat bar. Peach actually is a nice surprise. Strawberry, not so much, but I'll move on. But I will say, I've always been a fan of Kit Kat bars. I just didn't know how many different flavors I could be a fan of.
Give me a
One
break.
Of my major
Give
surprises.
me a break.
Break me off a piece of that. You know, fun fact about Japan, Kit Kat in Japanese, kitakato means like good luck. May you have good luck. And so it became a huge thing. Parents would give it to their kids on exam day.
Oh.
And so Kit Kat culture really kind of took off, partially because of the way Kit Kat translates into Japanese.
So while you are eating your matcha Kit Kat, I also noticed that you have an I voted sticker. Of course, it was 100 degrees in New York City on Tuesday, primary day, election day for the mayor's race. What was the turnout like at your polling place despite the weather?
Jill, I went late morning and went straight in really quickly. I think voting took me about approximately 2.5 minutes, from start to finish. And that's partially because we have this like special ranked voting system in New York. So you rank your candidates like this is my first, choice, second choice through fifth choice. And so that's having an impact on the results. And Jill, let's talk about those results for a second. A stunning upset on Tuesday night in New York. We thought it might be a while before we know the result, but it turns out that it appears the 33-year-old upstart Assemblyman Zoran Mamdani, who would be the youngest mayor in 100 years in New York, and again, 33 years old, pulled off a victory against Andrew Cuomo, the former governor, the son of another former governor, and Mario Cuomo thought he was a shoo-in. Had the support of the entire financial establishment, real estate developers, all the power brokers of Washington, former Mayor Mike Bloomberg as well, had all come out in support of him running a moderate agenda, a business-friendly agenda. But Mamdani, really trying to tackle the cost of living crisis, his agenda was very focused on free buses, freezing the rent prices, increasing taxes on the wealthy, a whole bunch of free stuff, and that appears to have won out here, at least in the Democratic primary. It was a multi-candidate primary. And as I mentioned, we've ranked choice voting. So neither Cuomo nor Mamdani got 50%, which is what you need to win. But Mamdani got about 44%, Cuomo about 36%. And Mamdani had an alliance with another candidate, which means this other candidate, Brad Lander, told all of his voters, rank me 1, but then rank Mamdani 2. So when the expected numbers come out from round 2, round 3, round 4, round 5, all the people whose candidates didn't win go to the second choice, the third choice, the fourth choice. Mamdani will safely get above 50%, and that's why Cuomo called him last night to concede. Again, we thought that it might be till next week, and this could be pretty close, but Mamdani dominated, and to the point where Cuomo has made himself eligible to run as an independent in the fall in the general election, but given the embarrassing result last night, that is less likely here. So what happens now? Mamdani is the Democratic primary victor in New York, and he will go up in the fall against Eric Adams, the current mayor of New York, who happened to be a Democrat, but was doing so poorly, he decided to just skip the primary and run as an independent in the fall. So you'll have Eric Adams as an independent. You'll have Mamdani as the Democratic Socialist. And then there's a Republican named Curtis Sliwa who ran last time, expected to get again around 25 or 30%. But it's going to be very interesting because Mamdani will have to explain why he is qualified to be mayor of New York at 33 with very few accomplishments. He's been an activist, an assemblyman for just a couple of years. And that was the rap on him that Cuomo tried to do. But Cuomo ultimately running a very lazy campaign. And these are Democrats talking. These are people who know him talking. He sort of just expected to just be in there. Yeah, I was your governor. I did a whole bunch of stuff. Bring me back again. And that didn't work for him. There's a generational appetite for generational change, it appears, out there. This reminds me a lot of the 2008 primary between Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, where Hillary was like, oh, my husband was president, I was first lady, bring me in and I'll do some stuff. And Obama said, no, it's time for a new generation, new ideas, etc., and crushed her in the Democratic primary and went on, of course, to become president for 2 terms. So in this case, you have Mamdani, who had this really grassroots support. I got more text messages and calls from the Mamdani campaign. I got 0 from the Cuomo campaign. So it really showed that they were trying to reach out to every potential voter in New York. He had a lot of volunteers, a lot of excitement around him. And so now it appears to be at least a 3-way race in the fall. And Adams, of course, is now hoping that all the Democratic establishment that left him for Cuomo will come back to him in the fall. As he, says that he'll run against a guy with no record, who is a extreme progressive, who will bankrupt the city. And then we'll see what happens with the Republican Sliwa, who's been sort of a long-standing guy in New York City politics, but New York obviously has been a very Democratic city for a very long time. So we're going to watch what happens here in the fall. But very interesting results out of New York City, America's largest city. And a reminder here, when you're mayor of New York, you're effectively running a city with a population that is larger than 38 states. So you have larger constituencies than 38 governors in the country. Of course, the financial capital of the world, hugely influential. And so we will closely watch this and what it means for the National Democratic Party, if there's any lessons to be learned from Mamdani and his views. And then, of course, what rap Democrats will take for some of Mamdani's very progressive views. We'll see what happens.
All right, let's get to some headlines here. The shaky ceasefire between Israel and Iran continues to hold, especially after President Trump read the riot act to Iran and Israel.
Yeah, mainly had words for Benjamin Netanyahu on Tuesday morning. Jill, I haven't seen Donald Trump this mad publicly in a very long time.
I thought the same thing, Moshe. It comes as early intel assessments are coming in on how much damage was done to the Iranian nuclear arsenal. One very preliminary U.S. assessment suggests that the strikes only set Iran back a few months, while an Israeli assessment says that they've been set back years. Time will tell.
Yeah, we will dive into the various assessments thus far from that 12-day war.
Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy says that health insurers promised to change the prior authorization process. It comes as Kennedy was on Capitol Hill for a contentious hearing, and he denied lying to senators about his vaccine policy in order to be confirmed. To Business News, choosing that buy now, pay later at checkout will factor into your credit score, but some experts say it may not be all bad. We'll explain. And how Amazon plans to bring faster delivery to thousands of small towns and cities. And Moshe, we're getting close to Amazon's summer Prime Day or Prime Week. And Moshe is on this day in history.
Jill, the rainbow flag, the pride flag, made its debut on this day in history. We'll tell you the backstory.
All right, the fragile ceasefire between Israel and Iran appears to be holding, at least for now. Speaking to reporters on the way to the NATO summit in the Netherlands, President Trump says he is confident that the ceasefire will last. He says both Israel and Iran are exhausted.
Tired of it. I think they don't want it to happen again. And Iran's not going to have a nuclear weapon, by the way. I think it's the last thing on their mind right now.
Iran, by the way, as recently as Tuesday, said that it is ready to resume its nuclear program and uranium enrichment without interruption. Unclear whether that's a statement to save face or whether they actually want to pursue that program again seriously. And it comes as Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu said Tuesday he reserves the right to bomb Iran again if they are moving towards nuclear weapons. Also unclear at this time, the status of Iran's nuclear facilities and its enrichment uranium. The question being, did Iran move the enriched uranium before Israel and then the United States began bombing the nuclear sites? And on Tuesday, an early U.S. intel assessment from the Defense Intelligence Agency that was leaked to CNN and the New York Times suggests that the strikes on Iran did not destroy Iran's nuclear program and only set them back by months.
So, Jill, we should note that this is a Defense Intelligence Agency estimate, and the DIA, as they're called, is just one of 18 intelligence agencies in the U.S. government. Yes, that is right, 18 intelligence agencies. So there's the CIA, the DIA, the State Department has an intel agency, DHS has an intel agency, the Energy Department has an intel agency. Then there's the National Geospatial Agency that handles satellite surveillance, signals intelligence, and it goes on and on and on. So this is just one agency's preliminary assessment here. We're just 48 hours in. This is mainly based on satellite pictures. They got to get intel on the ground, what they call human intelligence. Both the Israelis do and the Americans do. But this does serve at least this early assessment of the U.S. strikes specifically on Saturday night that included the 14 bunker busters plus several dozen Tomahawk missiles. Trump has previously said that the U.S. obliterated the Iranian nuclear program. This assessment says, well, we might have buried the program, but it's not clear that we obliterated the program. Nonetheless, the White House is taking issue with this assessment, not surprisingly, taking issue with the fact that it was leaked to the media. Caroline Leavitt, the White House press secretary, who tends to put out these very, strongly worded incendiary statements, she said that this was leaked by a, quote, low-level loser in the intel agency there, modeling sort of the words of her boss.
An LLL?
LLL, a low-level loser. Listen, it defies what they're saying. We're gonna learn more over time. They don't love leaks, and they especially don't love leaks that go in contrast with what the message they're putting out right now. So that is something we'll continue to watch here.
Leavitt also saying that whoever leaked it was doing it to embarrass the Trump administration.
Which totally could be true. There are a lot of people in the intelligence community who don't like President Trump and his words that he's had for them over the years. This is part of the frustration that Trump has, right? The federal government is immense, 2 million people. There are a lot of people who work for him. Many of them are Democrats. And so ultimately here, that is one of the issues. And that's just something to keep in mind. You're going to see, folks, a lot of headlines coming out over the coming days, weeks, months, frankly, about the impact here. One assessment says this, one assessment says that. Now, this is specifically an assessment based on satellite data of, looking at pictures, basically, of the three sites. So again, there's a lot to dive into here. The Israelis have done their initial comprehensive assessment, though they say they're also going to take weeks and months to really gather how much damage was done here to the Iranian program. The question really is not whether damage was done. We know damage was done. How much damage and how significant damage? Now, the Israelis say their initial assessments say that the Iranian program, if they choose to pursue it again, has been set back several years. Remember, they assassinated dozens of Iranian nuclear scientists, the top commanding generals. They literally blew up all the roads to the facilities and the facilities themselves. We still don't have a full scope of everything that was done on the ground there. We do know that the Israelis infiltrated the Iranian government and nuclear program pretty significantly. So the question, of course, is the fact that Natanz, the main reactor there, was destroyed completely. Isfahan, severe damage, unclear what's inside. Fordow, severe damage, not clear what was inside. And what I mean by inside is the Iranians for years have been enriching uranium to a very high level, just below weapons grade level. And so the question is, were they able to get that uranium out? Where did they put it? If the Israelis and the Americans destroyed that uranium, that enriched uranium, that's a lot. If somehow the uranium lives somewhere else, but the facilities are gone, that's not insignificant, but certainly they're able to then put together sort of a cheaper version of a nuclear weapon if they choose to do that. Again, one of the goals here from the American perspective and the Israeli perspective was, let us make this so painful for Iran, they don't want to do this again. The Israelis displayed their supremacy over Iran, controlling the air over Iran, basically bombing whatever they wanted over the course of the last 12 days. The Iranians failed to shoot down a single Israeli plane or even launch their own air force over the course of the week and a half. So, they're hoping that Iran, when it picks up the pieces here, literally, might question whether they want to pursue this again. Like, should we pursue a nuclear program again? Because this was a pretty crappy week and a half for us. And, we lost billions of dollars in damage, embarrassed domestically, embarrassed internationally, top folks assassinated. But, they preserve that know-how. The Iranians have been seeing assassinations for years as part of the covert effort by the U.S. and particularly the Israelis to assassinate leaders here, blow up things here and there. There's actually a series on Apple TV called Tehran. If you're interested in sort of a behind-the-scenes dramatized version of what's been going on through the years, that's a series that basically showcases Israeli intelligence operatives on the ground, a dramatic series inside Iran. If this has sort of spurred your interest, I imagine ratings, streaming downloads for that are going to be pretty good, Jill. coming out of this. And so we will get a sense of what happens next here. The key thing, again, is will the Iranians go for this again? And a lot of it hinges on the 86-year-old Ayatollah, supreme leader, Khamenei, who's been hiding in a bunker, so paranoid by all the assassinations that he stopped using a cell phone. So they couldn't get hold of him for a while. That was actually one of Trump's frustrations that led to the bombings over the weekend, was he's like, hey, let's make a deal. And everything goes through him in Iran. They couldn't get a hold of him. So at some point, Trump's like, screw this, I'm going to bomb. And so that's ultimately what happens on Saturday night. And so now the question comes out of this, once the supreme leader is in communication again with his people, will there be negotiations? Because ultimately there needs to be some sort of deal here beyond the ceasefire deal, some sort of agreement. Does the U.S. say to Iran in a deal, listen, it was pretty bad for you guys, huh? How about this? You have civilian nuclear energy reactors. We will provide you with uranium. You have lost privileges to enrich your own uranium, and make a deal like that. And so there's a lot of potential scenarios here that the U.S. presents and hope to get an agreement with Iran, being like, hey, after this whole thing, are you guys sure you want to pursue this quote unquote peaceful program that sort of is on the edge of weapons, et cetera, et cetera? And so a lot will speak to the Ayatollah, and then potentially the people around him who are like, yeah, can we not go through this again? And then it'll be interesting to watch what we can glean from that internal debate in Iran. One thing we do know, Jill, is Trump is very much hoping for talks with Iran moving forward.
Along those lines, Trump softened his tone when it comes to Iran on Tuesday, saying that he is not looking for regime change, appearing to walk back comments that he had made a couple of days ago, suggesting that Iran might need a change in regime.
No, I don't want it. I'd like to see everything calm down as quickly as possible. Regime change takes chaos.
And as we've talked about here on the podcast, and as most analysts would tell you, you cannot force regime change on a country. The people of Iran would have to do that themselves. That, meanwhile, was President Trump again talking on Air Force One en route to NATO.
Yeah, though I will say we do have an history of regime change. One of the reasons you bring that up, Jill, is because we did try to force regime change on various countries through the years, sometimes through the CIA, sometimes through, let's say, Iraq in the early 2000s, literally invading a country and taking out their leader. I think we've learned lessons as Americans about the perils of regime change. For the most part, it typically didn't work out long term for us or, frankly, the country. What's notable here about the tone here, and I think people are like, wait a second. On Sunday, Trump was talking about regime change in Iran. On Tuesday, he was like, I don't want regime change in Iran. What changed? Well, there's a ceasefire, and Trump's hoping for diplomacy here. And so we've seen this before, right? He softens his tone when there are talks. He starts to talk more warmly about people like Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un and Xi Jinping and several leaders around the world when he's trying to set the table for talks. He's like, I'm going to speak more nicely about them, and then they might be more amenable to make the concessions that I want. Listen, he's a negotiator, right? So that's how that's a tried and true tactic for Donald Trump. So don't be surprised by hearing kinder words about the Islamic regime in the coming days and weeks here, as Trump hopes to get them back to the table and strike the deal like I proposed. This is Moshe's proposal, Mo News's proposal, not the U.S. proposal, at least not that I'm aware of, which is the we'll enrich uranium for you. Let's strike a deal here. Hopefully the last 2 weeks were so painful for you, you don't make us go through this again. And that's interesting here again, because the Israelis are like, by the way, if you ever pursue, weapons again, we'll bomb you again.
So the president's tone was also a big change from a few hours earlier on Tuesday, when the president showed his anger and frustration at both Iran and Israel for seeming to threaten the ceasefire. Remember, President Trump had originally announced the ceasefire via a post on Truth Social at around 6 p.m. Eastern time Tuesday. He laid out a timeline. It was actually a bit confusing, saying that the ceasefire would begin after Israel and Iran, quote, wound down their in-progress and final missions.
Yeah, he had the Iranians have 12 hours, the Israelis have 24 hours, and both sides tried to take advantage of those sort of bizarre time windows.
As does happen when ceasefires are imposed, you tend to see either side kind of just giving it their last all. So there were reports that Israel was carrying out some of its heaviest bombardments of the entire, quote, 12-day war. Afterward, Iran began firing rockets at Israel, including one on Tuesday morning that killed 4 people in the Israeli city of Beersheba. The city's main hospital was also hit. Israel says at least one of those rockets was fired after the ceasefire was supposed to have taken effect. So needless to say, Israel vowed a big response to the Beersheba attack, the tit for tat threatening to violate the ceasefire that had been announced less than 24 hours prior. So President Trump, not too pleased. Here's what he told reporters as he left the White House on Tuesday morning.
Israel says that Iran violated the peace agreement and the ceasefire agreement. Do you believe that Iran is still committed to peace?
Yeah, I do. They violated it, but Israel violated it too.
Are you questioning if Israel is committed?
Israel, as soon as we made the deal, they came out and they dropped a load of bombs, the likes of which I've never seen before. The biggest load that we've seen. I'm not happy with Israel. You know, when I say, okay, now you have 12 hours, you don't go out in the first hour and just drop everything you have on them. So I'm not happy with them. I'm not happy with Iran either. But I'm really unhappy if Israel's going out this morning because of one rocket that didn't land, that was shot, perhaps by mistake, that didn't land. I'm not happy about that. You know what? We basically have two countries that have been fighting so long and so hard that they don't know what the fuck they're doing. Do you understand that?
Jill, he only got a few hours of sleep. He was up late. I was up late too. He was like still tweeting like after 1 a.m. Then he was up super early in the morning. Again, you can watch this based on social media. Then having to take a flight, very early in the morning to NATO, which we know that he doesn't like NATO. He hates NATO, but he's going to NATO. He's at the NATO summit right now in Europe. And so, I think this was a big achievement for him. We have peace in our time. He did an interview with NBC where he's like, this could last forever, this ceasefire. And as I was dealing with it Monday night and Tuesday morning, he just was getting so frustrated with these two.
By the way, on the plane to NATO, when he was talking to reporters, he's like, now I'm heading to NATO. Let's see what problems that will bring me. But not to take anything away from President Trump and this negotiated ceasefire. But I did see one analysis that I thought was interesting, which was, there is a reason that when you negotiate a ceasefire, usually there's real statements that are put out. It's not necessarily done via social media.
By the third party, by Trump, without there were hours that went by on Monday night where the Israelis and Iranians both wouldn't confirm there was a ceasefire. The only person who's confirmed the ceasefire was Trump, who effectively, I guess it's pretty clear here that he forced it upon them, announced it so they could not back out of it. So he announces it to the world. And they're like, oh, I guess this thing is real. And then, but like Donald Trump, when you force a ceasefire upon these two, and they have a bunch of planes loaded on the Israeli side and a bunch of missiles ready to go off on the Iranian side, well, we saw what unfolded there. But it was very interesting, Joe, those words for Netanyahu, Trump was livid with him. And you could hear it with the F-bomb that he dropped in that bite that we just played.
So Israel was reportedly planning to strike 15, quote, important regime targets in response to Iran's violation of the ceasefire. But President Trump spoke to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu by phone, with Trump telling Netanyahu in no uncertain terms, do not carry out the attack, turn the planes around. And then he wrote on social media at 6:50 a.m. on Tuesday, chastising Israel in all caps, do not drop those bombs. If you do, it is a major violation. Bring your pilots home now. And about 30 minutes later, that warning seems to have landed. He wrote on social media, Israel is not going to attack Iran. All planes will turn around and head home while doing a friendly plane wave to Iran. Nobody will be hurt.
One of those waves you do from an F-15 or F-16 at an enemy country.
Like a fist pump. He said nobody will be hurt. The ceasefire is in effect. So in the end, Netanyahu stopped the planes. The Israelis hit a single radar target. There was no collateral damage. So here we are, Moshe, as we record this podcast. We're a bit more than 24 hours since the ceasefire was first announced. And it appears, whether it's shaky or fragile, pick your adjective, that it's holding.
Yeah, it's holding for now, and I think it'll hold in the short to medium term here. Netanyahu did give a speech last night in Israel declaring victory, saying, I think the quote was that he sent the nuclear program of Iran down the drain over the course of the 12-day war there, targeting all aspects of the nuclear program, assassinating the chief scientist of the program, taking out a bunch of top generals, also major damage to the Iranian ballistic missile program. And that was a big goal here for the Israelis as well. It's not just the nukes, but it's those huge intercontinental ballistic missiles that they had and they experienced the wrath of at least a few missiles, the few dozen missiles that got through the Israeli missile shield, and that they were able to target the factories that make this. I mean, part of the issue the Iranians will have moving forward with their missile program, there are key components of that they depend on the Chinese for and the Russians for. So those countries will be playing a key role here. And the question is to what extent will they be helping the Iranians moving forward? So Iran has a lot of pieces to put back together here when it comes to their military program, when it comes to their nuclear program. Again, if they choose to pursue that. Netanyahu made a point in his speech, by the way, of thanking President Trump, saying, hey, you were great and I really love you. Not an exact quote, but that was effectively what he was saying, especially in light of the phone conversations that appeared not to have been as friendly on Tuesday morning. But there's those intel assessments we talked about in terms of how much damage was done here, and appears pretty significant damage. Again, the question, of course, is what does Iran do next? What do the Israelis do next? And as I mentioned on yesterday's podcast, given what the Israelis have discovered about their ability to basically fly over most of the Middle East these days, you can kind of see a scenario where in the coming months and years, similar to the ceasefire that they have with Hezbollah, that when the Israelis, and this is what you heard from Netanyahu, when the Israelis see potential issues in Iran, they're moving certain missiles to certain places, or they're building certain things, or their intelligence tells them that Iran's moving in a certain direction that's threatening Israel, that Israel might, we might be seeing headlines. In fact, I'm sure we'll be seeing headlines, and we'll be covering them over the course of the next couple of years, where Israel conducted some sort of strike inside Iran. So we will probably see back and forth exchanges like we've seen previous to this war, but we saw a couple times last year in the coming years, because as far as the Israelis are concerned, they view Iran as an existential threat. It is a country that is committed to their destruction, literally as part of Iranian Islamic regime foreign policy. And so, that's what we'll probably see medium to long term. Jill, the reality on the ground, too, that we'll be watching is what happens inside Iran, where we already know the Islamic regime is extremely unpopular. There were those major protests, the Masa Amini protests from a year and a half ago. So where do the people go next? There's a lot of concern I've heard from various Iranian activists that leaving the Islamic regime in place, the fact that Trump is now saying, oh, no, I don't really need a regime change. They're very worried about an emboldened Islamic regime that is super paranoid now after having been infiltrated, that they will be arresting and potentially killing a whole number of people inside Iran who they suspect might have helped the Americans or the Israelis in this case. So that is a super concerning thing to Iranians who are hoping for regime change at some point. So that is, an interesting situation we will be watching on the ground there, how this war has changed the reality there. As far as the regime is concerned, they held a victory rally in Tehran yesterday with regime supporters claiming this was great for them. That's to be expected from the Iranian regime. They've declared victory every day for the last 47 years. So ultimately, they did that yesterday. And one actual victory they got yesterday was Trump said, Chinese, feel free to buy Iranian oil. And that's been a huge issue for the Iranians. They have some of the largest oil and natural gas assets in the world. There have been huge sanctions put on Iran in recent years that have limited their ability to sell it. And so the fact that Trump is greenlighting that, again, this is part of probably these talks with the Iranians, which is, I will give you certain concessions if you don't go back to making nukes.
So Moshe, in all, the 12-day war, as President Trump is calling it, in all, we had 29 people killed in Israel, all civilians. More than 3,000 were hospitalized. We should note that the Israeli intel originally estimated that hundreds or even potentially several thousands of Israelis could have been killed, but the Israeli military was more successful than they had expected, especially initially, and Iran's military weaker than projected. In Iran, at least 600 people are estimated to be killed. Unclear how many were military versus civilians. The Iranian regime does not release numbers. Now, despite the ceasefire, there is still the Iranian proxy group, the Houthis in Yemen. They will not go away, Moshe. They're like the one group that's just...
At least rhetorically, Jill.
So they say they are not bound by the ceasefire and will continue their attacks until, quote, the aggression against Gaza stops and the siege is lifted, though they are dependent on missiles from Iran. It isn't clear how much Iran has to give them at the moment. And the really big picture here, also not resolved, is the war in Gaza. But many analysts now say that they think that there is a potential opening now for getting a deal that could end the fighting once and for all.
One thing to keep in mind here is that Netanyahu is more popular after this war than he was before the war. So that gives him actual power to ironically, end the war in Gaza sooner than he probably could have before this. Remember, Netanyahu has a coalition in Israel. Part of that coalition are these more right-wing parties that want a super aggressive approach in Gaza. Some of them actually want Israel to completely take Gaza and make it part of Israel again. That is not Netanyahu's stance, but he has people in his coalition who want that. Now that Netanyahu is more empowered, he can actually challenge those people on the right a bit and actually cut a deal. So an empowered Netanyahu off of this Iran victory can potentially end this war in Gaza sooner. So, it's hard to, there's a lot of 3D chess you play with in the Middle East, but an Iran loss actually turns out to be bad for Hamas, but actually better for a quicker end, I should say, to the war in Gaza for Palestinians to be done with that war, and for Netanyahu to be able to strike a deal here that maybe Israelis wouldn't have accepted, especially sort of in the sort of right-wing flank, where he'll have to give up a certain number of Palestinian prisoners for the Israeli hostages to come home. Now that he had this huge victory in Iran from the Israeli perspective, he can feel more comfortable making more concessions here to end that war in Gaza. So we'll watch that in the coming weeks here. That's certainly something Trump has been pushing for.
All right, time for the speed read from the New York Times. The nation's largest health insurers voluntarily agreed to streamline the controversial prior authorization process, often required for medical procedures to be covered by insurance. Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. making that announcement earlier this week. Prior authorization requires approval from a patient's insurance company before a patient can access certain tests, procedures, or medications. The policy has faced growing criticism from patients and doctors because it can delay or even deny people from receiving life-saving treatment, and it often creates hours of paperwork for healthcare providers. Here's RFK Jr.
85% of Americans say that they have had delays in healthcare because of prior authorization. And the doctors hate it. Doctors report that it costs them 12 to 15 hours a week filling out forms. Some nurses are spending over half their time dealing with the administrative burden of this. And healthcare is often delayed to Americans.
Kennedy also shared a story about a friend who is a doctor who was sued by a patient's insurance company. That patient was from New Jersey. He said the patient was suffering from severe heart failure and urgently needed a medical heart pump, which was a device that was essential to sustain that person's life until they would be able to get a heart transplant. Well, it turns out the insurance company approved the heart transplant, but not the heart pump, saying that it was unnecessary. Kennedy said the medical team chose to prioritize the patient's survival in planting the medical heart pump, but then the doctor was sued by the insurance company. Now, the lawsuit was eventually dropped, but Kennedy says there are situations like this happening all of the time where Americans' lives are put at risk because of this idea of prior authorization from your insurance company.
Yeah, this is a huge frustration. And we've heard from some of you in the Mo News community talking about your frustrations, general frustrations with the insurance industry, with health insurance, as well as this prior authorization issue. Under this new agreement, and this is just an agreement, a pledge, not a new law, but a pledge these insurance companies have taken, they say they will reduce the number of services requiring prior authorization. By 2027, so just under 2 years from now, insurance companies aim to approve 80% of electronic prior authorization requests in real time. The pledge also includes a commitment to cover previously authorized treatments for at least 90 days when patients switch insurance plans. Several dozen health insurance companies have agreed to this. That includes United Healthcare, Aetna, Cigna, Blue Cross. So I imagine many of you in the audience might be insured through one of those companies. Altogether, the insurers who agreed to this provide health insurance for 260 million Americans. So basically just over two-thirds of the country. A number of Americans have dealt with issues here when it comes to prior authorization. Health policy experts are skeptical here. These insurance companies will actually follow through with this. But federal officials have warned that if they don't do this, insurers will face new regulations. And this is something we've seen from HHS and Kennedy in the past few months. And it also goes to the MAHA stuff with, getting chemicals out of food, which is, we've seen these announcements, these pledges these companies have taken, but the government has said, if you don't follow through on these pledges, of which there is no punishment for not following through, we will go through Congress and regulation. Now, they're chomping at the bit for that, Jill, because that's where the insurers have lobbyists who will fight that. So how much will they do? How much of it will be sort of window dressing versus actual change. That's something we'll watch.
Speaking of Health Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. from NBC News, on Tuesday, Kennedy was on Capitol Hill facing some tough questioning. At issue was Kennedy's decision earlier this month to abruptly fire all 17 members of the CDC's Advisory Committee on Vaccines. Well, during a hearing, he denied that he broke an agreement with Republican Senator Bill Cassidy from Louisiana. He's the chairman of the Senate Health Committee, to keep the CDC Vaccine Advisory Committee unchanged. Cassidy, if you remember, was one of the key votes in getting Kennedy confirmed. Cassidy had said in February that he had voted for Kennedy after Kennedy made a number of commitments, including to not make changes to that one committee. And again, Cassidy was really key to ensuring that Kennedy got confirmed for the secretary role. So listen to this exchange from Congresswoman Kim Schreier. She is a pediatrician, and she's also a Democrat from Washington. She was questioning RFK Jr. on whether he lied to Cassidy in order to get his confirmation vote.
It sounds to me like you gave him the answer he needed to hear in order to get his confirmation vote. And then as soon as you were secretary, you turned around and did whatever you want. You fired all 17 members.
I'm complying with all the agreements that I made
Mr.
with
Secretary,
Senator Cassidy.
You're now on the record. You lied to Senator Cassidy. You have lied to the American people. You have lied to parents about vaccines for 20 years. And I also want to be clear that I will lay all responsibility for every death from a vaccine-preventable illness at your feet.
So not mincing any words there, Moshe.
No, it's a rare opportunity for Capitol Hill these days. Some of the secretaries have made themselves more available than others for these oversight hearings, but certainly Kennedy has been getting a lot of it, and a lot of questions there as to what he said in the lead up to his confirmation to just kind of get through the process versus what he actually believes. And so there's a lot of frustration on Capitol Hill, including from some Republicans, including Cassidy, who you just mentioned. He's the Republican from Louisiana. He was key to getting him through. He's a physician. He's a strong proponent of vaccines. He put out a statement on Monday night saying he reluctantly voted for Kennedy. He's concerned about what Kennedy has done to this vaccine advisory committee, that the people that Kennedy has now appointed to it, he doesn't think are qualified. Now, Kennedy's argument is that the previous people on the committee had conflicts of interest, were too close to pharma and, major brands like that. Now, we should note, by law, Kennedy does have the power to fire everyone on that committee. It just has never been done all together before, all 17 of them in one fell swoop, with this accusation that they're all biased, so I'm getting rid of all of them. So that's what concerned folks there, given how important this committee is to kind of approving vaccines, overseeing things. We've actually seen in recent days, folks from the public health space talking about creating their own independent committee outside the government, because they're so concerned about, this new group that Kennedy has put together. Now, as far as Kennedy is concerned, he only believes in certain vaccines. He's long expressed skepticism for a number of vaccines, and a number of the people who work in various agencies in the federal government. But there has been a lot of concern in the public health world about what Kennedy is doing with all of it. And that's certainly something that you heard during the questioning on Capitol Hill yesterday. And Schreier, who you mentioned, Jill, actually described for Kennedy her experience treating extremely sick children with vaccine preventable illnesses who hadn't gotten the vaccine. And she was talking about the importance of the whooping cough vaccine among the various vaccines over time that Kennedy says he's been skeptical of.
Now to some business news from the Wall Street Journal. Choosing that buy now, pay later option at checkout will now factor into your credit score. The company behind the most widely used U.S. credit score, the Fair Isaac Corporation, or FICO, said Monday that it would roll out a new model that factors into its scores the buy now, pay later loans, or BNPL loans. They're now common at checkout when you make just about any online purchase these days. It is the first time that FICO has ever introduced a score to account for a type of loan. Factoring data from these short-term plans into credit scores requires more than just feeding the numbers into an existing algorithm. And that's because the current scoring models penalize customers for opening several new lines of credit in a short period, which would mean that opening 4 of these buy now, pay later loans in a 3-month period would cause a credit score to drop as much as it would if you open just say 4 credit cards in the same time frame, even though the BNPL loans are not as risky as credit cards. So FICO is going to be rolling out the new credit scoring model and offering it alongside its current one starting this fall.
So these short-term plans, where a customer often pays for a purchase in 4 installments over 6 weeks, are among the fastest growing types of consumer credit over the past few years, particularly among Gen Z. The value of the transactions in the U.S. is expected to reach $108 billion this year, according to some market research. And the growing reliance here on BNPL loans might actually be masking some of the economic stress that American consumers are experiencing right now. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau has warned about what they call loan stacking, where consumers juggle multiple BNPL loans at once. Because these loans haven't appeared on credit reports, lenders were often blind to how much debt a borrower had already taken on. So definitely bottom line here, if you use BNPL services, you should now be aware that consistent payments can now help your credit score, but missed payments on those BNPL loans could hurt your credit score.
And from CNBC, Amazon is expanding its rapid delivery machine to more rural corners of the United States. The company said Tuesday it plans to bring same or next day delivery to more than 4,000 smaller cities, towns, and rural communities across the country for the first time by the end of this year. It's part of a previously announced small town expansion that will see Amazon spend about $4 billion by the end of 2026 to triple the size of its rural delivery network. Amazon has made speedy delivery a cornerstone of its juggernaut e-commerce business as it faces heightened competition from brick and mortar stores like Walmart and newer entrants like Temu, Shein, and TikTok Shop, which have hooked shoppers with their ultra discounted items.
This announcement, by the way, comes as Amazon prepares for its what they call longest ever Prime Day. Prime Day this year, Jill, will be 96 hours. So what is that? 1, 2, 3. That's 4 days.
Which is sort of what each day feels like these days.
Yeah,
in terms of
like
the
so
news
a day
cycle.
feels like 96 hours. So Prime Day will be 4 days this year. Kicks off on July 8th. So just after the holiday there. All right, now time for On This Day in History. We begin in 1950 on this day when North Korea unleashed an attack southward across the 38th parallel. The UN Security Council passed a resolution calling on UN members to assist South Korea. The war goes on for about 3 years, and it results in a stalemate. Basically, the border between North and South Korea remaining near where it was at the beginning of the war. The armistice establishes a new border, granting South Korea a bit of additional territory, demilitarizing an area, what they call now the DMZ, between the two countries. But a formal peace treaty was never signed. So we sit here 70 years later, still basically a state of war there between the Koreas. We have tens of thousands of U.S. troops there. And of course, you know, we sort of continue to watch third generation now of the family leading North Korea, Kim Jong-un, and his every move. Though, frankly, Jill, given everything we've been seeing globally in the past couple of years, he's been kind of the quietest of the,
Dictators?
rogue authoritarian leaders that we've been watching. Yeah. On this day in 1978, the first version of the rainbow flag, which represents LGBTQ pride, was flown during a San Francisco Gay Freedom Day parade. So this is June 25th, 1978. Activists for the first time hoist this rainbow flag. It was created by this guy, Gilbert Baker. He was a drag queen and clothing designer. And he just decided for the parade that year, he's like, I'm going to make this like rainbow flag. And each color had a specific meaning. Pink was for sexuality, red for life, orange for healing, yellow for the sun, green for nature, on and on. And he just brought it to the parade. People were like, oh my God, I love that flag. And he was shocked at how quickly it took off and effectively would become the flag, the representation for gay rights and gay pride. On this day in history, sad day in history, I remember exactly where I was on this day, June 25th, 2009, the king of pop, Michael Jackson, died of cardiac arrest in LA at the age of 50. His death ultimately, sadly, was caused by a lethal combination of sedatives and propofol, which is an anesthetic. It was ruled a homicide, actually, and his doctor, Conrad Murray, would be found guilty of involuntary manslaughter. It was actually my last day of work, Jill, at Fox News. I remember I was turning in my BlackBerry to date myself, June 25th, 2009. I had just taken a job at Bloomberg Television, was ready to move to New York. I was cleaning out my desk, packing up my bag, and I saw the alert come through that Michael Jackson had died. And I was like, oh my God, I got to help out. And like, you know, at the time you saw like find videos. We weren't digitized at that time. And then I like look around. I was like, wait a second. I've already given my 2 weeks notice. This is my last day of work, like my last hour of work. Like, I'm going to leave now.
I'm out.
I mean, I did help, for like an hour or two. And I was like, wait, I don't need to do this anymore. Like I have a new job.
I was actually at a bar restaurant in the Times Square area because I was going to see a Broadway show, and the news broke and they just started playing all Michael Jackson songs. And it was nice actually to be with other people because, as you said, it was just one of those moments that I think people of our generation, or if you lived through it, you know where you were.
Yeah, no, and you only have a few of those a decade, right? Where it's like, you know exactly where you were, and that's one of them. Speaking of another artist we lost way too soon on this day in history, Prince released Purple Rain on this day in 1984. Purple Rain is officially 41 years old today. We also had a couple big album debuts on this day in history, Jill. On this day in 1996, June 25th, 96, Jay-Z releases his debut album called Reasonable Doubt. Unless you're like a hardcore Jay-Z fan, you don't know many of the songs or any of the songs from that album. It was viewed as a critical success, but not a commercial success. But ultimately, that Jay-Z, he would figure it out in future albums.
Yeah, as they say, he's not a businessman. He's a businessman.
I'm a businessman. As far as a album debut on this day in history that was like sort of crushed it commercially on this day in 2002, 23 years ago today, Maroon 5. They actually have a new album coming out, a new concert tour. But they released their debut album on this day in history, Songs About Jane. That included This Love, Sunday Morning, and Harder to Breathe.
Great album, and I was not aware that they had a new one coming out. So I was wondering what happened to Maroon 5.
Well, they're still around, Jill. They're a business, man. No, you know, and it, by the way, it tells you, like, they had this great debut album, and by the way, Maroon 5 has done incredibly well, but, like, you know, Jay-Z had this sort of soft launch with his debut album, and then sort of just goes straight up from there. So trajectory of all these artists, you know, always fascinating to watch, especially the ones that, you know, continue to put out hit over hit, decade after decade. And there's a few artists like that who have put out number one hits over several decades. The Cher's, the
Madonna,
Billy the Rolling
Joel,
Stones,
Bruce Springsteen.
Yeah, exactly. By the way, Jill, we should know today, June 25th, Global Beatles Day, not the bug, the band.
I figured
the Beatles,
that transition.
The Beatles on this day in history, I think it was a date, June 25th in the late 60s, performed All You Need Is Love. And so somehow years later, we decided to make this Global Beatles Day. So if you hear Beatles music or you're a Beatles fan, today is your day. All you need is love. Imagine, you know. By the way, speaking of a group that, like, you just like look at their list of hits, you're like, oh my God, like hit after hit after hit after. You're like, oh my God, that's the Beatles too, and that's the Beatles too. And they were only together for a few years.
When you were off, I had Nicole Lappin from the Money News Network filling in, and it was Paul McCartney's birthday. And we were saying, you know, we just are lucky to be alive at the same time that he is, because he is just one of the greats.
The Paul McCartney, who was like performing in the late 50s, like still at it after all these years. Another person who, decade after decade, continues to, you know, be prolific in his art form.
All right, that's a wrap. Thank you all for listening to the Mo News Podcast. If you like what you hear, please share this with your friends. It will help us grow. Follow us, subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and review us in the App Store. All of the reviews help. The good ones, anyway.
Yeah, your reviews help us not just be a businessman, but make Mo News a business, man.
Let's go so you stop using that.
Let's see you guys.
Thanks for listening to the Mo News Podcast. Have a fantastic day. I hope you enjoyed.